I'm all mixed up, you know. I mean, I can't keep up with everything that's happening. And,
well, I think
Elvis Presley telephone logs were released recently. Nothing looked out of the ordinary except a particular late-night call, and the strangest detail of all was the person on the other end. What was Elvis trying to do in those final years, and was someone quietly standing in his way? Join us as we follow the trail that changes everything we thought we knew. The quiet release that no one expected. The records came from a private archive, the kind that sits untouched in storage for decades, boxes stacked on top of boxes, dust settling over everything like a blanket. While the world outside keeps spinning and forgetting that certain pieces of history are still waiting to be found, these particular documents had passed through several hands over the years: collectors, estate managers, people who understood their value but perhaps not their full significance, until finally they reached researchers who actually sat down and read them, page by page, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. At first glance, they looked like exactly what they were: telephone logs, the kind of administrative paperwork that any busy office would produce, columns of dates and times, outgoing and incoming calls, durations measured in minutes, occasional notes scribbled in the margins by whoever was responsible for keeping track. It was dry material, the sort of thing that makes a person's eyes go heavy after the first few pages. Nothing about it screamed sensation or scandal. Nothing demanded urgent attention. It looked like the boring background machinery of a very large and very complicated celebrity operation. But researchers kept reading, and somewhere deep inside the stack of pages, buried beneath weeks and months of his perfectly ordinary entries, something shifted. A particular call appeared, longer than the others, placed at an unusual hour, and suddenly the whole document felt different. The way a room feels different when you realize someone else has been standing in the corner the entire time, and you only just notice them. This was not a conspiracy theory waiting to be born. Nobody was suggesting secret plots or shadowy figures pulling invisible strings. The documents themselves were straightforward records. No hidden codes, no dramatic revelations scrawled in invisible ink, just dates, numbers, and time. But context is everything, and when you place those dates and numbers against the backdrop of what was happening in Elvis Presley's life during that specific period, the picture that forms is quietly extraordinary. Because timing matters more than almost anything else in a story. And the timing of this particular call, on that particular night, during those particular months, raises questions that have no easy answers. Questions that historians and fans and researchers will now be turning over in their minds for years to come. Not because the documents prove something shocking, but because they suggest something far more interesting than shock. They suggest that behind the glittering and complicated and often painful story of the most famous entertainer who ever lived, there may have been a chapter that nobody knew was being written. The world around the king. To understand why one phone call matters, you first have to understand the world that Elvis Presley was living inside during the 1970s, and that world was not simple. It was complicated and pressured and full of obligations that stretched in every direction like ropes tied around a man who was trying very hard to keep moving forward. Elvis, by this point, was not just a singer, he was an entire industry, a machine that employed dozens of people, generated millions of dollars every single year, and carried the expectations of an audience that numbered in the tens of millions across every corner of the planet. His name alone was worth extraordinary amounts of money. His image appeared on merchandise and posters and magazine covers without pause. He was beyond famous in a way that very few human beings ever experience. The kind of fame that stops feeling like a compliment and starts feeling like a weight. At the center of the business operation stood Colonel Tom Parker, the manager who had guided Elvis's career for decades, whose contracts shaped the financial architecture of everything Elvis did. The touring schedules, the recording deals, the film appearances, the licensing arrangements. Colonel Parker was not simply an advisor or a helpful guide standing politely in the background. He was woven into the structure of the entire enterprise in ways that made it almost impossible to separate the manager from the machine. His agreements with Elvis and with the major entertainment companies of the era were layered and complex and had been built up over many years into something that functioned almost like a second gravity, invisible but constantly pulling. Publicly, Elvis remained the icon, the man who had changed music, who had made the whole world move differently, whose voice on a recording could still silence a room and make people feel something they struggled to put into words. Audiences filled every venue he performed in. The reviews spoke of his continuing power as a performer. The image held together remarkably well from the outside. The jumpsuits and the dark hair and the charisma that seemed to pour off him without any effort at all. But privately, the picture was different and far more difficult. Documented reports from people who were there during this period describe a man who was exhausted in the deepest possible sense of the word, not just physically tired from the relentless touring schedule that kept him moving from city to city without adequate rest, but worn down in a way that went much further than the body. The separation from Priscilla Presley had altered the landscape of his personal life in ways that were permanent and painful. The home that had once contained a family was now something else entirely, and the structure of his daily existence had shifted in ways that left certain spaces feeling very empty. The financial arrangements that governed his professional life had been examined and debated by historians and music industry analysts for years. Questions about the terms of his contracts, about how the money flowed and where it went, and who benefited most from the extraordinary revenues being generated. These were questions that seemed to grow more complicated the deeper anyone looked. And for Elvis himself, surrounded by an inner circle that had its own loyalties and its own interests, the possibility of stepping back and evaluating everything clearly was not as simple as it might sound. Too many people depended on the machine continuing exactly as it was, and that is the world the telephone logs come from. A world that looked one way from the outside and felt like something else entirely from within. The pattern in that logs, when researchers began mapping out the calls in careful detail, something started to emerge from the pages that was hard to ignore. Not dramatic at first. Not the kind of thing that makes a person sit up straight in their chair and feel their heartbeat faster, but persistent, the way a quiet sound in an empty house becomes impossible to stop noticing once you have heard it the first time. The logs covered several months of telephone activity, and within those months there was a rhythm. Outgoing calls placed late at night when the rest of the world was dark and still. Calls that suggested a man who was most comfortable reaching out after the daytime noise had settled, after the handlers and the assistants and the endless parade of people who surrounded him had finally gone quiet. There was something almost lonely about the pattern, something that spoke of a person thinking more clearly when the room was empty. Most of the calls were brief, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, the kind of duration that suggests quick check-ins or simple exchanges of information. Nothing that would raise an eyebrow on its own. But one specific number appeared again and again across the weeks. Not every night, but regularly enough to stand out, consistently enough to suggest that whoever was on the other end of that line was not a casual contact or a passing acquaintance, but someone Elvis was deliberately and repeatedly choosing to reach. Researchers noted the frequency carefully, cross-referencing dates and durations, building a picture of communication that had a clear and intentional shape to it. This was not random. This was not the scattered calling pattern of someone simply working through a list of names. This had structure, and structure implies purpose, and purpose is where ordinary paperwork stops being ordinary and starts becoming something worth examining very closely. The single detail that changed everything about the pattern was the duration of one particular call, while every previous connection to that same number had lasted only a few minutes at most. This one stretched far beyond anything that had come before it, long enough to suggest a real conversation. Long enough to indicate that something was being worked through or discussed or decided. Long enough to feel completely different in character from every other entry surrounding it in the logs. There is no transcript to read, no recording sitting in an archive somewhere waiting to be played, no notes from either party describing what passed between them during those extended minutes. Only the timestamp marking when the call began, and the timestamp marking when it ended, and the silence of the page where any explanation should be. That absence of explanation is not nothing. In a document that records everything else so precisely, it feels like the loudest thing in the room, the call that breaks the pattern. The date itself sits within the final stretch of Elvis's career, not at the very end, but close enough to that ending, that looking back now, the timing feels significant in a way that is difficult to shake, It was a period when people around him were beginning to notice changes that went beyond the ordinary pressures of a demanding schedule, when the strain that had been building for months was starting to show itself in ways that could not easily be explained away or smoothed over with careful public relations. The call was placed late, well past the hour when most people in his circle would have expected any serious business to be conducted, and it lasted long enough to separate itself completely from every other entry in those logs that connected to the same number, where previous calls had been measured in a handful of minutes. This one stretched into territory that could only mean something genuinely substantial was being said, something that required time and attention and could not be compressed into a quick exchange. The duration alone changed the meaning of everything around it. What happened immediately after is where the story deepens in a way that feels almost too neat to be coincidence. Though coincidence is exactly what it may be, because the calls to that specific number stopped, not reduced, not spaced further apart, but stopped entirely. The number that had appeared repeatedly across weeks and months of logged activity simply vanished from the outgoing records, replaced by nothing but the continuation of other routine calls to other familiar contacts, as though that particular line of communication had been deliberately closed. Public appearances continued in the weeks following. Elvis performed and traveled and maintained the visible shape of a career still moving forward, but people who were present during this period have described in interviews and memoirs something that felt different about him. A quality of distance or heaviness that sat underneath the performance and could not entirely be hidden. His face in photographs from those weeks carries something that is hard to name precisely, but easy to recognize. The look of a person carrying a private weight that has not yet found anywhere to go. Whether the call produced that weight or simply coincided with it is impossible to determine from documents alone. Correlation is not cause, and a long phone call in the night does not by itself prove that anything changed or failed or broke apart in the hours that followed. But the sequence is real and documented and verifiable. The call happened, the silence followed, and the strain was visible. And when three things line up that cleanly in a timeline, the mind naturally reaches for a connection even when the evidence will not fully permit one. The identity behind the number. Tracing. The number itself required careful work, the kind of methodical cross-referencing that moves slowly and does not produce satisfying answers quickly. Researchers working with telephone records from that era faced the additional difficulty of dealing with documentation systems that were far less precise and comprehensive than anything that exists today. Numbers changed hands, directories went out of date. Connections between people and the lines they used were not always cleanly recorded or preserved. And yet the trail, followed patiently enough, eventually led somewhere. The number did not belong to anyone inside the immediate world that most people would associate with Elvis Presley. It was not connected to family members or to the close personal circle that surrounded him at Graceland. It was not attached to a name that appeared regularly in the entertainment press or in the documented social landscape of his daily life. The person on the other end of those repeated late-night calls existed at a meaningful distance from the inner machinery of the Elvis operation, which in itself was unusual enough to warrant serious attention. What researchers were able to establish through the kind of painstaking archival work that rarely makes exciting reading, but occasionally produces genuinely significant results, was a connection between the number and a figure who had intersected with Elvis's professional world during an earlier period. Someone whose background touched the business and legal frameworks that governed how money and contracts and arrangements were structured in the entertainment industry of that era. Not a household name, not someone whose involvement would have been obvious or expected, but someone whose specific area of knowledge aligned in an interesting way with the pressures that Elvis was known to be navigating during those months. The implication that follows from this is careful and circumstantial, but not unreasonable. When a person in a complicated professional situation begins making repeated private calls to someone connected to legal or business structures outside their existing circle, the most natural interpretation is that they are seeking a perspective that their current advisors either cannot or will not provide. Artists attempting to understand their own contracts or to evaluate whether different arrangements might be possible have historically done exactly this kind of quiet, preliminary reaching out before any formal action is ever taken or even seriously considered. Nothing in the documents confirms that Elvis was attempting to renegotiate anything. No legal filing exists from this period that connects to the identity behind the number. No formal move was ever recorded, and the calls stopped before whatever was being explored had any visible consequence. But the shape of the evidence, the repeated contact, the late hours, the identity of the person being called, and the timing against the backdrop of documented professional strain creates a picture that asks to be looked at seriously even if it cannot yet be fully explained. The power equation. To appreciate the full weight of what those telephone logs might represent, it is necessary to understand something about the environment in which Elvis Presley operated professionally, because it was not a simple environment, and it was not one that responded kindly to the idea of change. It was a structure that had been built carefully over many years by people with significant interests in keeping things exactly as they were, and the foundations of that structure ran deeper than most people on the outside ever fully understood. Colonel Tom Parker had not simply managed Elvis's career in the way that an ordinary manager handles schedules and negotiations. He had become embedded in the financial architecture of the entire operation in a way that made genuine separation, or restructuring, an extraordinarily complicated proposition. The contracts that bound Elvis to Parker and Parker's arrangements to the major companies involved in recording and distribution were not the kind of agreements that could be quietly revisited over a polite conversation. They were layered documents built across decades, each one reinforcing the ones that came before it, creating a structure that was deliberately and perhaps intentionally difficult to exit or alter without significant consequence. The financial framework that resulted from these arrangements had been a subject of discussion and debate among industry observers for years. Questions about the proportions in which revenues were divided, about the terms under which Elvis performed and recorded, about the long-term implications of agreements signed during an earlier and more vulnerable period of his career. These questions did not have simple answers, and the people best positioned to answer them were often the same people with the most to lose from the answers being examined too closely. Breaking into that structure from the inside would have required courage and resources and a willingness to absorb considerable disruption, not just professionally, but personally, because the people involved in maintaining the existing arrangements were not distant corporate entities, but individuals who were woven into the daily fabric of Elvis's life, people he had known for years, people whose livelihoods depended on the machine continuing to operate without interruption. The human cost of any serious attempt at change would have been immediate and real and impossible to pretend away. And yet artists had done it before, had found ways to push back against arrangements that no longer served them, had sought outside counsel and built quiet cases before making any visible move. History offered examples of exactly this kind of careful preliminary work undertaken in private before anything surfaced publicly, which is precisely why the pattern in those logs feels so charged when placed against this backdrop. Oh, no legal filing ever confirmed that Elvis took formal action. The existing arrangements remained in place through the remainder of his career without documented disruption. And whatever was being explored in those late-night calls never translated into anything the public record can confirm. But the tension between what the documents suggest and what the formal record shows is not evidence of nothing. It is evidence of a door that may have been considered, examined carefully in the dark, and then left unopened. And that possibility carries a particular sadness that is hard to read around. Reframing, the final chapter. The story of Elvis Presley's final years has been told many times and in many different ways, but the version that has settled most firmly into public understanding is one built largely around the idea of decline, a great talent overwhelmed by circumstances. A man whose extraordinary gifts were gradually consumed by exhaustion and isolation, and the accumulated pressures of a life lived at an intensity that very few human beings ever experience or survive intact. It is a story that is sad and human, and not without truth. But it may not be the complete picture, and these telephone logs introduce a complication that the familiar narrative was not built to accommodate. Because the image of Elvis that emerges from a careful reading of those documents is not straightforwardly the image of a man surrendering. It is something more complicated and in certain ways more affecting than simple decline. A man making repeated deliberate calls to a specific contact outside his established circle, doing so consistently across weeks and months, choosing the late hours when privacy was most available, and then placing one extended call that broke every pattern that had come before it. That is not the behavior of someone who has stopped caring about his own situation. That is the behavior of someone who is thinking, evaluating, reaching. The alternative interpretation that the logs make available does not require abandoning everything that is already known about Elvis during this period. The health struggles were real and documented. The exhaustion was genuine and observed by people who were present. The personal difficulties were not invented or exaggerated by historians working with incomplete information. None of that disappears when you add the possibility that alongside all of it, something else was also happening, something quieter and more private and more intentional. What changes is the emotional quality of the final chapter. The sense of what Elvis was experiencing internally during those months shifts when you introduce the possibility that he was not simply enduring his circumstances, but actively, if quietly, considering whether different circumstances might be possible. That small shift in interpretation does not require any fabrication or any claim beyond what the documents themselves support. It requires only the willingness to sit with the evidence and allow it to complicate the story, rather than forcing it to fit the version that already exists. Legends are often flattened by the stories told about them, reduced to a single defining quality that makes them easier to remember and harder to actually understand. Elvis has been flattened in this way more thoroughly than almost anyone. And what these logs offer, carefully and without overpromising, is a small piece of his full dimension returned. Not a rewritten history, but a richer one. Not a different man, but a more complete one. And that is worth more than any sensation. What we know versus what we don't. There is a particular discipline required when dealing with historical documents that carry emotional weight. A responsibility to hold the line clearly between what the evidence actually establishes and what the mind is tempted to build on top of it, because the temptation is real and understandable. A story this compelling pulls the imagination forward, and the imagination does not always wait for permission before filling in the gaps, which is why this chapter exists, to draw that line carefully and keep it visible. What is confirmed is this. The telephone logs are genuine documents that have been examined by researchers working with appropriate archival standards. Their authenticity has not been seriously challenged, and the records they contain reflect real activity. The calls happened, the timestamps are real. The pattern of repeated contact with a specific number across several months of documented activity is not an interpretation, but a fact present in the pages themselves. And the single extended call that breaks that pattern is equally real and equally verifiable within the same documents. The timing of that extended call against the backdrop of what was happening in Elvis Presley's professional life during the same period is also a matter of documented record. The strain that historians and contemporaneous observers have described from those months is not invented context, applied after the fact to make the logs more interesting. It existed independently and was noted by people who were present long before these particular documents surfaced. The alignment between the call and that documented strain is genuine, even if its meaning remains uncertain. What is not confirmed is everything that gives the story its emotional power. The subject of the conversation that took place during that extended call is unknown and will likely remain unknown. No transcript exists and no recording has surfaced. The identity behind the number has been traced to a figure with relevant professional background. But that connection does not confirm what was discussed, or what, if anything, was requested or offered. The silence in the logs that followed the call could mean a decision was made, or a door was closed, or simply that the contact was no longer needed for reasons that had nothing to do with anything significant. Whether any formal action followed from whatever was discussed is equally unresolved. The absence of legal filings or documented renegotiation attempts from this period could mean that whatever was being considered was abandoned before reaching any stage that would leave a formal record. Or it could mean that the call was about something else entirely that simply does not align with the interpretation that the surrounding context makes so tempting. Holding both of these things at the same time, the confirmed reality of the documents and the genuine uncertainty of their meaning is uncomfortable but necessary, because the story deserves that honesty, and so does Elvis Presley. The legacy question. There is something that happens to a person's understanding of a life when a single small detail shifts the angle of the light falling across it. Nothing dramatic, nothing that rewrites every fact already known, just a quiet repositioning that makes previously flat surfaces reveal unexpected depth. And that is precisely what these telephone logs do to the story of Elvis Presley's final chapter, when you allow yourself to sit with them seriously and follow where they lead without rushing toward a conclusion. For decades, the question surrounding those last years has been framed almost entirely around loss. What was taken from him, what he lost access to, what faded and what collapsed. And that framing is not wrong, because the losses were real and documented and genuinely painful to examine. But loss is only one possible lens, and it has a tendency when applied too exclusively to obscure things that were still present, still active, still reaching forward even inside circumstances that were genuinely difficult. If Elvis was making those calls with intention, if he was quietly and privately reaching beyond the established circle of people whose interests were already decided, if he was spending late hours on the telephone with someone connected to the kind of knowledge that might help him understand his own situation more clearly, then something was alive in him during those months that the familiar narrative of decline does not easily accommodate. Something that looked less like surrender and more like a man trying to find a handhold on his own story. That reframing matters not because it makes the ending less sad. It does not. The ending remains what it was, and nothing in these documents changes the basic shape of what happened, but it matters because it returns to Elvis a quality of agency that the decline narrative quietly removes from him. It suggests that inside the exhaustion and the pressure and the personal difficulty, there was still a person making calculations, still someone who had not entirely accepted that the terms of his professional life were simply fixed and permanent and beyond any possibility of examination. The legacy of Elvis Presley has always been complicated by the gap between the public image and the private reality, between the icon that the world consumed and the human being who carried that iconhood through daily life at enormous personal cost. And what these logs contribute to that ongoing conversation is a small but genuine addition to the private side of the ledger. A glimpse of something interior and unperformed and real. He may have been exploring something. He may have been considering something. He may have spent those late night hours reaching carefully toward a different version of his own future. And even if that reaching never produced anything formal or visible or recorded in any document that survives, the reaching itself was real. And a man still reaching is not a man who has given up. And that distinction, quiet as it is, feels important enough to carry forward into everything written about him from here.